Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. We now have viewers from every single one of the 50 states across the nation, and we have a growing national membership in addition to a strong membership in California. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on our upcoming programs, both in person and live stream. We are also introducing new membership benefits, including exclusive events and invitations to free film screenings. Becoming a member is a great way to support our organization and to help us continue to provide you with this quality programming. So please go to our website and join today. For those of you who want to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will manage your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 30 minutes. It's now my pleasure to bring on our own Professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, great to see you.
No lack of breaking news for you.
Boy, yeah, I know we talked a little bit about Afghanistan and Iraq last week, but certainly the last 7 days have left us with quite a bit more to talk about there. So we're going to go back into that one in just a minute.
And you have worked furiously over the last 24 hours to resculpt your focus today. So Dan is going to only focus on two areas today, as he mentioned. Number one, who lost Afghanistan and what comes next? And then if we have time, the second topic will be the next fight in the climate change wars. And Dan and I were also going to share with all of you a decision that we've made to make some adjustments to politics in the time of coronavirus. So you're the first to hear. One of the things that's so important to us is to continue to retain this phenomenal audience that follows Dan every week in politics in the time of coronavirus. And many of our members and audience have been saying that now they're starting to move back into an office environment. So what we would like to do is, with your support and input, we'd like to move his time frame on Tuesdays to 5 o'clock, beginning September 7th. Dan will continue to produce the after programs every other week, and that again will start on September 7th. And we hope that you'll all support us, and we appreciate your flexibility with this. And as always, you can respond to our emails with the survey input as how this will be working. So again, the next couple of weeks, everything status quo, the 24th and the 31st, same time. And then after Labor Day, we're going to launch Dan into the evening time frame. Are you excited, Dan?
Yes, prime time coronavirus.
Okay.
So look, we're very grateful and we're very flattered for how many of you, even as your days get busier and as other obligations begin to crop up, we're extremely flattered by how many of you have stuck with us in this midday time slot. But we've been hearing from more and more of our members and our viewers that as the world opens up, to some degree, thanks to the Delta variant, that evenings would become much easier for them. So whether you're on the East Coast, whether you're on the West Coast watching us at 5 o'clock, or on the East Coast watching us at 8 p.m., we hope you'll make the switch with us to the evening hours, and we'll be excited to continue talking with you in the weeks and months ahead. So like Kim said, next couple weeks, business as usual in 11 a.m. Pacific time, but starting the day after Labor Day, we are now an evening program rather than a morning one. How about that, Kim?
Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, and thanks as always to all of you for being with us. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the fact that you've stuck with us even as more and more of the world has begun to open up and more of us have begun to venture out during the day, it's really gratifying to see the tremendous audience that we still draw. But we hope you will come with us for the evening. I'm looking forward to that one as well. In the meantime, though, as Kim mentioned, lots to discuss. And it seems a little bit incredible to me that it was just 7 days ago that we were talking about the differences in the United States withdrawals from Afghanistan and Iraq. And I talked last Tuesday about how a more gradual shift of the US military presence in Iraq from combat troops to an advisory and training role had created a much more stable situation in that country than in Afghanistan, which seemed to be 7 short days ago on the verge of bedlam and catastrophe. But little did we know how much bedlam and how quick the catastrophe would come. If anything, I'll admit I clearly, like many people, I clearly underestimated the speed and severity of Afghanistan's destruction. I mentioned the importance of the government's goal of holding their strongholds, the cities of Kandahar and Kabul. Well, the Taliban took control of Kandahar less than 2 days later without even firing a shot. And Kabul, of course, fell just a few days after that. By Sunday, we were all watching heart-wrenching footage of Afghani families fleeing their homes. And by yesterday, we were watching what I thought was even more horrific footage of people so desperate to escape that they overwhelmed the airport tarmac where US troops were overseeing a very frantic and largely improvised evacuation. Now, as most of you know, over the last 18 months, even through some fairly trying times, I normally try to look for some signs of encouragement, even in very difficult circumstances. But I'm going to admit something to you. I'm not really sure how to do that today, except for maybe to hope that our leaders will learn some valuable lessons to prevent this type of debacle and this type of tragedy from occurring again. So lots to unwrap here, but let's start with all of you. So Claire, if you can post for us the first question, pretty straightforward for everyone to consider. Who lost Afghanistan? Was it George W. Bush for diverting attention to Iraq early on in our presence in Afghanistan? Was it Barack Obama who, after the surge, which, as you remember, had a defined time ending, was it Obama for hollowing out our US presence there and encouraging the Taliban by telling them that we were only staying for a short period of time? Was it Donald Trump for last year agreeing to the pullout as in a peace treaty with the Taliban, a very untrustworthy partner, no question about it? Or is it Joe Biden's fault for deciding to follow through on Trump's commitment and given the circumstances under which that withdrawal has been accomplished? Or E, is it all of the above? Do all four of the presidents who've served since the beginning of the war in Afghanistan almost 20 years ago now, do they share responsibility for this debacle? Claire, let's see what our group has to say. Wow, look at that. I'm not surprised that our smart group opted for the final option, but 76%, that's a really extraordinary figure. 3/4 of you say that the blame is to be shared, maybe not precisely equally, but all four of our presidents bear some responsibility for this. Within that, I think you see a small number that Trump and Bush draw a little bit higher numbers, 10 and 9%, whereas Biden only gets 5% and Barack Obama only 1%. There's just a few of you who think that Obama's handling of the surge and the withdrawal after that caused the problem. My own answer, and I normally don't answer our poll questions, but my own answer is E, all of the above. I agree with most of you. The Bush administration never adequately funded the work that needed to be done in Afghanistan and fatally shifted our attention and resources from Afghanistan to Iraq. Obama, as I mentioned a moment ago, oversaw a troop surge, but with a publicly announced defined ending date, which merely encouraged the Taliban to wait us out. And the troop withdrawals that followed made it even harder for the United States and NATO to to maintain control and conduct meaningful training. Now, Trump, of course, actually held peace talks with the Taliban and agreed to a full withdrawal by earlier this year. And Biden has now both completed the departure and overseen what is inarguably a chaotic and disorganized pullout that has created, arguably, this country's most embarrassing moment on the world stage in decades. So plenty of blame to go around. But the more important question than simply just pointing fingers, the more important question is what comes next. And I'll try to address that question today at three levels. Number one, what happens next in the country of Afghanistan itself? Number two, what are the political ramifications here in the United States? And third, what does this mean for the United States' stature and credibility on the world stage? At least today, not a lot good to offer on any of those three fronts. So in Afghanistan, the return of Taliban rule most likely means the return of some of the most onerous and intolerant leadership anywhere in the world. It means the return of persecution for religious and ethnic minorities. It means the worst type of revenge against the tens of thousands of Afghanis who tried to support Americans and our allies over the last 20 years. And most painful, perhaps, is that it likely means the end of any educational or professional or cultural opportunities for the women and girls of that country. Now, earlier today, as many of you may have seen, the Taliban issued a somewhat conciliatory public statement of what they called amnesty, partial amnesty, but already in many areas under Taliban control. Girls' schools have reportedly been closed, women have been forced out of their jobs, and they've been told to send a male relative to replace them in their workplaces. And many women are already being forced to marry a Taliban fighter. What else does it mean? It likely means a full-blown refugee crisis, as millions of Afghanis will flood neighboring countries as they try to escape. And ultimately, what we're probably going to see is the creation of a similar challenge to Europe, as we have recently with immigrants from Syria and Libya. And it means the hollowing out of Afghanistan's professional class and skilled workers who are going to try to flee, as we saw yesterday and today, by any means possible to escape the oppression that will be imposed upon them. So in addition to the country of Afghanistan itself, all sorts of problems for its neighbors, even bigger problems potentially for Europe trying to handle the migrant flow. But worst of all, the human rights disaster that's about to occur within the country of Afghanistan itself. Now let's move for a minute or two from Afghanistan to the US, because for Joe Biden, this is a political disaster of the worst magnitude. Beyond the policy and partisan ramifications, the very foundation of Joe Biden's campaign for president and his presidency to date has been one of competency. This is someone who knows how to get things done. This is someone who understands government and how it works. So, for example, Biden has earned praise from his oversight of the pandemic since taking office, even among many Republicans, for his management of the crisis in contrast to many voters' opinions of the way his predecessor dealt with it. But even setting aside the broader debate about whether or not Biden is right to pull out of Afghanistan, and we can discuss that more in the second half hour if you like, Biden has received the harshest criticism for the manner in which the evacuation was handled. Now, it's very clear that US intelligence dramatically overestimated the strength of Afghanistan's military, and equally dramatically understated the Taliban's capabilities. But while even a more orderly withdrawal would have left room for a discussion about whether the decision to leave was the right one or not, the pictures and the stories of the last few days and the days ahead are going to leave horrific memories with our nation and with the world of Americans who are unprepared and disorganized at a time when basic managerial competency was most needed. My own opinion is that Biden's efforts to pin the blame for the delay in evacuating Afghani loyalists on the Afghanistan government yesterday looked particularly unconvincing. And we'll see going forward whether his claims stand up to journalistic scrutiny and a congressional investigation. And Biden over time can certainly reclaim the reputation of being a competent manager, but it's going to take a while. And heading into very high profile fights on infrastructure, on immigration, on climate change, and many other issues, this is not a particularly good time for the president to take that kind of hit. Now, make no mistake, Biden is making a political calculation here. He's calculating that everyday Americans care more about getting out of Afghanistan than the fate of the Afghani people we're leaving behind. And the gamble is that the more he focuses on the larger message of ending the longest war in American history, the quicker things get better for him politically. But how that gamble turns out for the president depends directly on how bad the situation gets there over the next few days. Then there's the question of the United States standing in the world, which might be the most difficult problem we'll face going forward. Now, already the comparisons between the American departure from Afghanistan and our evacuation from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon almost half a century ago are flying fast and furious just about everywhere. But if you think back to the 1970s, the long-lasting international impact of the nature of the US's very rapid withdrawal from Vietnam was a generation of US adversaries who learned that if they simply waited long enough, the Americans would eventually get bored and go home. And we saw this happen elsewhere in Southeast Asia at that time, in Cambodia and Laos. We saw it in Africa, in countries like Angola and Somalia. We saw it in Nicaragua and Iran, and many other places in the world. And the loss of US credibility after this pullout, I believe, will have equally grave consequences across the globe for American credibility for a long time to come. The greatest potential damage could be in the Middle East, because you have Iran and its various client organizations considering the benefits of just waiting out the Americans. Many of our Middle Eastern opponents think back not just to Vietnam, but to the US withdrawal from Lebanon in the aftermath of the bombing of the US military installation in Beirut in the 1980s, when 240 American service members were killed. The idea of outweighting the Americans has driven Iran's strategy for decades, and it has shaped and will continue to shape the tactics on which Hamas, on Hezbollah, on Al-Qaeda, on the Islamic State, and others have relied ever since. But the Middle East isn't the only place where this is a problem. Our Western European allies are already wondering if the US is going to continue to stand with Ukraine. Politicians in South Korea and Japan are raising similar questions about our resolve with North Korea. And get this, China's largest newspaper yesterday ran a headline that read, quote, "Failure of America in Afghanistan serves as warning to Taiwan secessionists," unquote. So clearly China's government and its media mouthpiece are already suggesting that US allies in the Pacific Rim have a lot more to worry about. Now, just as Biden ran for president as someone who knew how to make government work, he also presented himself as a president who would rebuild our international relationships and restore the US's reputation as a reliable ally. And we've talked quite a bit over the last several months about the work he's done in this area with NATO, at the G7 summit, and in individual meetings and conversations with other world leaders to reassure coalition partners that they could once again count on America to be there for them. And those efforts aren't gone for good, not by any means, but they've been undermined very significantly in the last several days. And there's a great deal of rebuilding work that the Biden administration is going to have to do with our allies around the world. I mentioned earlier the contrast between the debacle in Afghanistan and the more gradual shift in Iraq. And one could certainly argue that the similar presence of non-combat US troops over the years in Germany, in South Korea, and Japan for decades now has contributed to the stability of those regions around the world. But remember that our withdrawal from Iraq several years ago had to be reversed in the face of aggression from the Islamic State. So it's entirely possible that Biden or one of his successors may find themselves back in Afghanistan to push back against the Taliban or one of its allies in the not too distant future. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, has already told US senators in a briefing this past Sunday that his analysts now see the likelihood of Afghanistan becoming a terrorist hub again is something that might happen within the next couple of years. And other experts outside the military are saying it could be a matter of months, 1 year or less, for Al-Qaeda and others to re-emerge in Afghanistan the way they did in the time before September 11th, 2001. Now, Biden has made it clear, and accurately, that this is a mess that was left to him by Donald Trump. And as we discussed earlier, it was Trump's administration that made this deal with the Taliban. And many of Biden's advisors argue that if the US hadn't kept to Trump's agreement from last year, we would have this year seen US troops under direct attack from Taliban fighters. And as we discussed last week, American public opinion has been very solidly behind both Trump and Biden in support of the US withdrawal. But those poll numbers are already dropping. There's a political poll out this morning showing that support for US withdrawal from Afghanistan has dropped from 69% to 49% just in the last couple months. And my educated guess is that those poll numbers are going to drop even further given the images that we're seeing on the news and online. Now, Biden has made it clear since the early days of the Obama administration that he thought being in Afghanistan was a bad idea. So Trump undoubtedly left Biden with a very bad hand to play. But the decision to leave is very much in keeping with Biden's longtime convictions. In other words, Trump may have left him in a bad spot, but it didn't appear to cause Biden to do anything differently than he's wanted to do since the early stages of Barack Obama's presidency. I said earlier that the one good thing that could come from all this would be lessons to be learned going forward. And the particularly difficult thing here, in this instance, is that the lessons to learn from Afghanistan are not all that different from those our country learned from Vietnam. We learned back then to be wary of overly optimistic military leaders who told us what they wanted to be true rather than the facts on the ground as they actually existed. We learned back then that a military, a diplomatic, or a democratic achievement couldn't be more important to us as foreigners than it was to the people of the country itself. And we learned to be careful of allowing our country's innate aversion to involvement in foreign conflicts to drive decisions regarding safety, security, and stability that ceded fragile territory to bad actors and malevolent forces because of our desire to stop fighting and come home. Many of you have heard me use this quote before. It's one of my favorites. It comes from Mark Twain, and it's particularly apt here. History doesn't repeat itself. but it rhymes. But it took us many years back then to realize that a bad decision didn't have to be followed by even worse ones. So in addition to relearning the lessons of Vietnam, maybe we can add a new lesson this time. That the best way to fix a mistake is to stop making it and stop repeating it. And to start anew, demonstrating to both allies and opponents that this erratic withdrawal was an aberration and not a new habit. I would argue that the futures of Ukraine, of Iran, of Hong Kong, and Taiwan, just to name a few hotspots, just became even more important. And it's incumbent upon the Biden administration to reassure our allies and warn our opponents that regardless of what they think of the decision of whether or how to leave Afghanistan, does not reflect an ongoing attitude by the US as to its place in the world. So we've gone on, as I think you can tell, for just about almost our entire first half an hour on this topic. That's how much going on as it relates to this Afghanistan crisis. And so we will save the climate change topic and the post-Cuomo Me Too discussion until next week. But before we go to your questions, I have one more question for you. So Claire, thank you. The question for all of you to consider, how much will Afghanistan and what we've just experienced there, how much will this harm US credibility on the world stage going forward? Do you think, one, it will cause permanent or long-term damage? Number two, do you consider this to be a serious setback, but fixable in the short to medium-term future? Third, do you see this as a short-term and relatively minimal problem, primarily of perception? Or fourth, do you think this really isn't a problem and we need to keep our focus on Russia and China, and whether the people have responded poorly domestically and internationally to our pullout from Afghanistan, it simply isn't of as much importance as those greater geopolitical challenges? So Claire, how do we do? What did our red group have to say? Very interesting. Look at those responses. 53%, a little bit more than half, say that it is a serious setback, but it's one that can be repaired. And while I don't want to read too much into your answers, it sounds to me like once again we might be in agreement that the way to fix this problem is to concentrate even harder on shoring up US credibility and US commitment and some of the other challenging places that I mentioned around the world. 25% are more dour. 25% of us say that this is either permanent or long-term damage and it's not something we're going to fix anytime soon. 18% say it's more of a short-term problem, and 5% say, nope, it's just a distraction. Let's keep our eye on the bigger ongoing challenges. So very interesting insights from you as always. And thank you, Claire. And so because of the amount of time we spent on this enormously important and incredibly complex issue today, we are going to go right to questions. So if Jessica and Friend can join us, let's move on to the second half of our conversation. Jessica?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for pivoting to focus on this topic, because I think it was something we were all following very closely this weekend. And again, to our audience, before we launch into the Q&A, I just want to thank you, our viewers, for your continued support and contributions and the donations you make so that we can continue to host these important discussions. If you are able to, it would be greatly appreciated if you can go to our website and either become a member or make a donation. We would greatly appreciate it. And now let's get into these questions. We do have a lot coming in. You gave a lot of an assessment, but based on what you've seen, do you think Biden made the right decision to move forward on the follow through with this withdrawal?
Well, look, I know from reading our audience comments every week that there's a sizable number of people who think that I am a Biden apologist, There are others who think I'm a Republican in sheep's clothing who just looks for ways to go after him and other Democrats. And I guess the way I look at it, Jessica, is I figure if both sides are mad at me, it's sort of like being the baseball umpire. That means maybe we are navigating the middle the way we're supposed to. But on this one, and I may give some sustenance to those who are suspicious of my former Republican leanings, I think Biden made a mistake here. While it is true that the Trump administration signed a treaty with the Taliban, I think it's also true that Biden has felt strongly enough about other international matters. The climate change agreement in Paris is one of many examples, where Biden, the pipeline from Russia, the gas pipeline from Russia to Europe, many other occasions where Biden over the last several months has said, I disagree strongly enough with Donald Trump that I'm going to reverse his decision. And while there may have been security concerns within Afghanistan about the Taliban's reaction to that, it certainly would not have been the only time since taking office that Biden dramatically reversed a Trump decision. But to broaden it, once again, to get beyond the finger pointing as who's right and who's wrong, whose fault it is, my broader conclusion on this is to think back to why we went into Afghanistan in the first place. And there's an excellent piece on the Time Magazine website today by David French that I very strongly recommend to all of you. And what he suggests correctly is he draws a distinction, French does, between going into Afghanistan in order to stop the possibility of terrorist attack on the US homeland versus trying to eradicate Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations altogether. And French argues that while those two are similar, they're not identical. And what he points out correctly is that the US presence in Afghanistan over 20 years has meant that for all practical purposes, there has not been a jihadist attack, a successful one of any magnitude on the US homeland. And he also points out that over the last several years, as the US troop presence in Afghanistan has shrunk, the number of casualties we've faced, our country has faced in that country, has become relatively meaningful. Now, the death of any individual, civilian or service or service member, is a tragedy. But since 2014, there have been a total of 66 US military deaths in Afghanistan, less than 10 a year. And I think while we grieve for those servicemen and servicewomen and their families, it seems like an ongoing presence of 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 troops like we have in Iraq, and a non-combatant presence like we've had in Japan and South Korea and Germany for years and years and decades, seems to me, albeit in retrospect, like we could have maybe not made Afghanistan a safe and secure and honest and open democracy, but by leaving the country altogether and creating the conditions where a pre-9/11 terrorist presence can reassert itself, seems to me that it was an unnecessary risk. And the template that we have followed in other countries, I think could have worked in Afghanistan. I'm not privy to the briefings, and I respect the president's decision, even if I don't happen to agree with it. But we should note that it's been reported that his top military advisors advised against a total pullout for these reasons. So while the president's decision is understandable, this is the longest war America has ever fought. And he's correctly pointed out, if we stayed a year or 5 or 10, Afghanistan would not have become the country that we wanted it to. But Afghanistan didn't need to become the country we wanted it to. It just needed to be an imperfect place that was not a safe harbor for terrorists, and where little girls can go to school And for me, that's worth continuing a presence there in a non-combatant role, as we have in so many other countries around the world for so many years.
Thank you. I'm going to combine these two questions because they touch on similar topics. The first, would it be appropriate for some heads to roll? How about Khalilzad on the diplomatic front and someone in the military chain of command? And this other questioner said, I've spoken with troops over there throughout the years who share that the Afghanis were not interested in military training or preparedness. So why were those in government convinced otherwise? Who can be held responsible for the bad data that the Afghan forces were prepared when clearly they were not?
Well, as I said earlier, I think one of the lessons to be learned from Vietnam, and it appears now to be relearned from Afghanistan, is that the US military, for all the excellent work it does on our behalf and to provide safety and security around the world, in adverse circumstances, tends to present charitably speaking, a best case scenario. And as was the case in Vietnam, when it became clear that military leaders were actively misleading the country's political leaders and the country as a whole, as to our prospects in Vietnam, it's become equally clear that our country's military leaders have been dramatically exaggerating the capacity and the progress of Afghan training and military presence. It's clear that a large plurality of the enlisted soldiers were so-called ghost soldiers. They were simply on a payroll somewhere so their commanders could pocket their salaries. Many, many more were just simply not all that emotionally invested in the fight against the Taliban or in the effort to create a stable Afghan democracy. As I said earlier, another lesson from Vietnam to be relearned in Afghanistan is that we as foreigners can't want particular outcomes more than the people themselves. So will someone in the US chain of command be fired? Probably. But ultimately, whether it's fair or not, presidents get way too much of the credit for good things and way too much of the blame for bad things. And while there is an earnest and understandable debate about whether leaving Afghanistan was the right thing to do or not, the horrific way in which it was handled, rightly or not, will fall very squarely in Joe Biden's lap. President Biden himself has attempted to lay blame both on the Afghan government and the Afghan military for these problems, and we can talk more about this going forward. But yesterday was not one of his more attractive press conferences. And as I said earlier, it will be interesting as journalistic and congressional investigations progress, is to find out how much of Biden's blame laying is accurate, or at least how much of it is the entire story.
Did you see the press conference televised on CNN by the Taliban this morning? What is your reaction?
I did not see the news conference, but I read about it. And two things struck me, which are going to sound contradictory because they are. One, it's clear to me that the Taliban leadership is very aware of the need to present a friendlier, not a friendly face, but a friendlier face to the world. They realize that they can't be ostracized. They cannot afford to be pariahs. And so they're attempting to talk about amnesty for government workers, to allow women to play some type of role in society. But even, and I'll defer to people who actually saw the news conference, and I, of course, will watch it later, but even in the written accounts, it was clear how much the Taliban spokesperson was struggling to reconcile that friendlier face with some very deep-held, very doctrinaire and dangerous religious beliefs. And it's entirely possible that this Taliban, unlike the version from the 1990s and the early 2000s, will be more supportive of rights for women, of educational opportunities for little girls, of rights for ethnic and religious minorities. But there's no reason to believe that yet. And I think it's much more likely that they're making some early half-hearted efforts to try to keep from being the object of worldwide ostracization. It's already clear that Russia and China and Iran are already looking to establish helpful diplomatic relationships with the Taliban-run Afghan government. So it's unlikely that they'll be ostracized to the complete degree that Biden and other Western interests have warned. But if they talk a good game, even if they don't follow up on it, maybe that gives China and Russia enough of a fig leaf to maintain relationships with this government, even if they go back to the approaches and the horrors we remember from their previous regime.
Why would the US leave without taking the weapons, Black Hawks, etc.? Is that equipment heading now to Iran, and should our allies like Israel be upset with us?
One of the most difficult questions to understand, even before the last few days, is the speed with which US troops abandoned the Bagram Air Force Base and so many other military installations around the country. It was reported at the time that US troops simply just left in the night. And Afghan soldiers the next morning realized that there was no one there to help them, no air support to help direct them to continue their fight against the Taliban, and no contractors or repair specialists to help them keep that equipment operational. On one hand, there's no question that the Afghani troops' morale suffered a tremendous blow with the announcement of the US pullout earlier this summer. But what's been overlooked is that in addition to that morale hit, just operationally, the decision of the administration to pull out the military presence so quickly left the Afghani military in a situation where they simply could not function. Because the pullout was so rapid and so unexpected, a lot of very high-priced and very lethal U.S. military equipment fell into the hands of grifters, of black market arms peddlers, and of Taliban interests. And so by leaving that quickly, it not only leaves a gaping hole in terms of US support for the Afghani troops, but it makes the Taliban an even more powerful fighting force than it would have been already. And so the money lost, the prestige lost, the distrust with our allies increased, makes that decision a particularly difficult one to defend. And it's one that I haven't heard either the president or his advisors offer a particularly credible defense to explain.
Thank you. Has this emboldened China, and should Taiwan be nervous?
Well, as I read earlier, the headline in the largest China newspaper, and I will find it again so I can read it, makes it very clear the way China is going to argue this. The headline was, quote, "Failure of America in Afghanistan serves as warning to Taiwan secessionists." And I think what Taiwan is being told, what Hong Kong is being told, what Ukraine is being told, and many other US allies around the world are being told is the Americans are there for you today, but what makes you think they're going to be there for you tomorrow or next week or next month? They're going to cut and run on you the same way they did on the Afghanis. So you'd better come to terms with the fact that you're going to be left to your own devices. Yeah, Israel creates a more complicated situation, given its very significant military capacity. And perhaps, Jessica, this is a separate topic for us on another day. But I would actually argue, and French touches on this in his Time magazine piece, although I've read more about it elsewhere, that this withdrawal actually helps Israel in sort of an odd way. Because given the advent of the Abraham Accords last year, Israel's treaties with a small number of Arab Gulf states, the US's lack of reliability may make Iran's adversaries in the Middle East turn to Israel to a greater degree, knowing that Israel shares its commitment to pushing back against Iran, even if their certainty about the US being there to support them diminishes to some degree. Anyway, that's a longer conversation for another day, but it's very clear that, in my mind, that China and Russia, among others, see enormous opportunity here. The Chinese government is very, very nervous about having a radical Muslim state right on its border, given its treatment of the Uyghurs in Northwest China. They don't need any of that unrest spilling over into their country. So they're moving very quickly to establish relationships with the Taliban government. Neither China nor Russia's embassy, for that matter, has closed. They're still operating. And so for reasons both of defending itself against potential domestic unrest and for marginalizing the US on the world stage, this is an immense opportunity for China, and it's very clear that they're going to move very, very quickly to take advantage of that opportunity.
And this is a bit of a follow-up question to what you were just saying. What do you think will motivate the Taliban to operate differently this time? For example, trade with China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc.
It looks like the Taliban is going to make an effort, we'll see whether they can pull it off or not, to reassure enough countries around the world to work with them, to trade with them, to engage in diplomatic and economic activity with them. They're going to try to reassure them that they're not going to be as punitive in their behavior as they were in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As I said earlier, we'll see if that happens. If the Taliban decides that economic and diplomatic engagement is worth engaging in a less horrific way against the citizens of the nation, that would be really encouraging, but would also require them to fundamentally reject some of their most close-hold beliefs, and so I'm somewhat dubious that it's going to come off. Right now, at this point, my prediction, and as you know, I don't like predictions, but I'll make one anyway. It does appear that this is not so much the Taliban's effort to fool anyone, to think that they've become more open-minded, but rather to give a certain number of countries enough of a fig leaf to work under the pretense that the Taliban can be a more respected partner. Well, we'll see if it holds up.
Again, regarding focus on China, the U.S. Geological Service performed a survey of Afghanistan several years ago, and it turns out that there are significant deposits of minerals, metal, and rare earth resources. The U.S. ignored this, but China has already signed contracts with Afghanistan for rare earth minerals. How might this play out in our competition with China?
Very, very smart question, and very astute. Afghanistan does have tremendous deposits of all sorts of rare and valuable minerals. And China, as we know from their activities in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere, works very aggressively to develop these types of economic relationships with countries that hold these resources, because China doesn't have these resources, at least not in the quantity they need to support a population of their size. So in addition to all the other benefits, marginalizing the US, potentially quieting the Uyghurs, one of the many other reasons that China is so eager to step to the forefront in Afghanistan is for access to those resources, because it's something they desperately need to provide for their own population.
How do you assess the damage to our military and intelligence credibility?
Well, it's incalculable. It's, once again, I'll draw a Vietnam parallel, and I recognize, and I know we'll see this in the comments, I know the parallels are not precise, that there are very, very important differences between the situation we faced in Vietnam and the situation we have been more recently facing in Afghanistan, but there are very strong similarities as well. And just as it took the US military a great deal of time to regain its credibility with the American people after Vietnam, my concern is, particularly given the aggressive geopolitical challenges we face in other parts of the world, that once again, it's going to take the military some time to reestablish its credibility with the American people, just as was the case back in the 1970s. And the outcome of that lack of credibility, as I said earlier, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Angola, in Nicaragua, and so many other places, was a United States much more limited in its ability to act, even in trouble spots where its involvement might have been beneficial. So we talked, I guess, more personally about the challenge that exists for Biden, and we talked more broadly about the challenge that exists for the United States on the world stage. But the questioner is very smart to raise a question of credibility for the US military, because it's very clear in exaggerating the progress that's been made there over the years that the military's credibility will take a major hit with the American people, and almost certainly in Congress too.
Many of the evacuation photos show it's almost all military-aged men fleeing and very few women and children. The ones meant to fight are fleeing and the vulnerable were abandoned behind. This feels like a humanitarian disaster similar to what we've seen before, and which creates security issues in the receiving countries. Can you comment on this?
I couldn't agree more. There were some women in line at the airport in Kabul, but it was overwhelmingly military-age men, very few children, very few women, very few elderly. And I think the reasons for that are twofold and related. One, women in particular were frightened to be out in public, despite the so-called amnesty that the Taliban offered earlier today. And so as much as they want to get out of the country, being exposed in public, waiting in line at the airport seemed like a risk that would just be untenable, and you can't really blame them for coming to that conclusion. Second, there's widespread reports, even given the Taliban's news conference this morning, of whippings, of beheadings, and other types of very violent behavior on the part of Taliban regulars toward Afghani citizens who don't obey even fairly low-key directions on traffic and so forth. So just the physical danger on both parts means that we're probably not seeing a lot of the people who are most desperate to leave. And I think one of the many ways that the Biden administration can begin to rebuild that lost international credibility is by spearheading a multinational humanitarian effort to make it clear that not just the 88,000 Afghanis who worked with the US and NATO over the last 20 years, but women and girls and ethnic minorities in the country who want to leave are given the opportunity to do so. Now, the more aggressively the US and its allies pushes on this front, the more aggressively the Taliban will push back. So it is going to be both a security and a diplomatic challenge. But going back to what I said earlier about learning the lessons of Vietnam and convincing a world audience that what's happened this week is an aberration and not a sign of future attitude, I think that type of humanitarian effort could be a very important step in the direction. One other quick question, Jessica, if I can. One other quick point, Jessica, if I can. On the military question we were discussing a moment ago, it shouldn't be lost on any of us that in all the stories and all the news coverage of Biden's decision to pull out, that there are military sources making it clear that the president's military advisors, from the Secretary of Defense on down, were advising against the pullout. And my educated guess is that's the military recognizing that the credibility they're going to lose over the broader questions we were talking about a few minutes ago is trying to reassure at least Congress, if not some portion of the American people, that even if they were wrong about the Afghani military's capabilities, they were right and tried to warn Biden that the pullout would result in disaster. So they're aware of the problem they face, and they're already beginning to work to shore up their own defenses.
Can a parallel be drawn between the chaos at the southern border and the chaos at the US exit from Afghanistan? Is Biden simply too optimistic to expect negative surprises, or too driven by doctrinaire policies?
Well, I think the president's biggest critics, the president's biggest Republican critics, are already pointing to the US-Mexico border crisis and the Afghanistan crisis as two parts of the same overall failings. My own feeling is that that's somewhat of a stretch. They are two very different circumstances, and the thing they have in common most is that they're happening simultaneously. But both do represent a real struggle within the Biden administration. On one hand, to draw a very stark differentiator between this president and his predecessor, but on the other hand, not to cause such jarring change that it leads to unpredictable outcomes. These might be Biden's two greatest political and policy problems at this point. But at least for me, I don't necessarily see a strong line between them. If there's any, it's that successfully addressing both of these issues requires taking unpopular action. And Biden has seemed, at least in these two cases, to be reluctant to take action that would alienate or upset too many American voters. I wouldn't say that you can call that a trend after two examples, even two very high-profile examples, but it will be interesting going forward through the next 3.5 or perhaps 7.5 years, whether Biden is willing to fly in the face of public opinion if the U.S.'s international interests do require it.
Are there or were there any other countries involved in the peacekeeping attempts in Afghanistan? United Nations, where does the international community stand?
Well, there was a very sizable NATO presence in Afghanistan for the better part of 20 years. And it's worth noting that when the US declared war in the aftermath of September 11th, every country in NATO honored the basic concepts of that agreement by going to war with the United States. The idea that if one NATO country is attacked, then all must respond. So there has been a sizable NATO presence in Afghanistan over 20 years. There's clearly some hurt feelings, though, among NATO members that Biden's decision to withdraw was not something on which he consulted with them on any kind of meaningful basis. And the harshest criticisms are coming from mid-level, not the highest level politicians in Western European countries. But you've heard from Merkel and Macron and others some polite grumblings that perhaps this wasn't handled the way that it should. And legislators in those countries and others have pointed to Biden's promises to work in concert with our Western allies in a way that Trump did not do, and pointing out in not particularly polite terms that that's not a path that he followed as it related to the pullout.
Central Asia expert Paul Starr this morning said in a webinar that the changes of the last 20 years regarding education of women, cell phones, etc., will make it hard for the Taliban to reverse. What are your comments on this?
I hope he's right. He's a very smart man, and frankly, he knows much more about this than I do. But all I can say is I hope he's right. And if I were a woman or a girl in Afghanistan, pursuing an education, pursuing a career, wanting to live my life the way I have over the last 20 years, I don't know if I'd be willing to take that risk. So as we talked about earlier, as it related to the Taliban's call for amnesty, we'll see the degree to which they follow that up with more tolerant, or perhaps I should say less intolerant attitudes. But at least right now, that would be an immense risk to take. And if I had a daughter living in Afghanistan, I'm not sure I would encourage her to take it, saying, well, it's tough to go back 20 years in time. It will be a problem for the Taliban. It's worth remembering that in 2001, there were no such thing as smartphones. There was no such thing as Facebook. There was no such thing as social media. So there's all sorts of ways for people in Afghanistan to communicate and be heard, which simply didn't exist between 1996 and 2001. And so completely suppressing those voices and those tools of technology is going to be a challenge, which is going to be a difficult one for the Taliban, but it's going to be very, very difficult, whether it's women, whether it's ethnic minorities, whether it's others who disapprove of the Taliban's approach. It's going to be very, very difficult because they're going to be taking a much greater risk in having their voices heard, even if they have the technological capability to do so.
One final question, and since you've been talking a little bit about Vietnam, they mentioned this too. Isn't the lesson to be learned from both Vietnam and Afghanistan that we cannot impose our culture and notions of democracy upon nations that are historically or inherently unreceptive to those notions?
Sure, and this goes back, absolutely, and this goes back to the point that David French made in his time column this morning. The original goal in Afghanistan, at least as stated back in 2001, was not to create a Western-style democracy in that country. It was simply to protect the U.S. homeland from further terrorist attack. And if you define success in that very narrow way, which is appropriate, then our 20 years in Afghanistan was a success. But as the questioner correctly notes, if somewhere along the way we decided that protecting against the jihadist attack of terrorism was no longer a good enough goal, but to remake this country in our own image, then it isn't surprising that we were a failure. And that is a type of, for lack of a better term, cultural overreach that created a very difficult problem for us in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. Hopefully that's a lesson we'll learn going forward. That's beyond our capabilities, but it's almost certainly a lesson that if we do learn, we'll forget again. And at some point in the future, we'll be back in this type of situation in another world trouble spot. Like Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if enough time passes, even the smartest people can unlearn lessons that it took a long time to learn to begin with.
Well, thank you, Dan, so much. And to our audience, also thank you. Sorry, I keep looking over here at the audience, but you guys are out there. I know we're going to try to do some more programs in the coming weeks on this topic. So I think it's going to continue to unfold. So we will continue to work on that. And Dan, thank you again for pivoting to really dive into this topic. So I think we were all, like I said, ready to find out what we needed to know about this.
Well, thank you, Jessica. And for those of you who did want to hear a conversation on the other topics we've advertised, I promise we'll get to them. But I hope you would agree that spending the full hour on this incredibly complicated and incredibly important issue was a good decision on our part. But either way, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation again on next Tuesday.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kim. I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. I know how many questions you were managing, so thank you for doing such a great job. Now, Dan and I are going to transition over to his after the webinar session where members can interact directly with Dan and continue this conversation. So again, if you'd like to have that exclusive opportunity, please consider becoming a member. You can find out everything you need to know at our website. Let me just give a couple brief updates on upcoming programs, and then we'll conclude today's program. Of course, as we mentioned, Dan will be continuing at his usual time slot at 11 o'clock, both August 24th and the 35th. I think I got that right, 31st, not the 35th. And we will start at his new time slot, 5 p.m., starting Tuesday, September 7th. On August 19th, we have a live conversation with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She'll be joined by Abby Ginsburg, and this will be a discussion of her film, Truth to Power. On August 25th, we have Assessing Biden's Climate Policy with the Presidential Envoy for Climate Senior Advisor. And on the 15th of September, The Remarkable Odyssey of Angela Merkel. So please go to our website, sign up for upcoming programs, make a donation, become a member. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.